Hi friends, so glad you're back. This is our See the Light, Yes You Can Draw Club, and this is club meeting number 27. I'm so glad you're here. I'm Pat Nepley, I'm your master artist. I'll be with you through all of these. Now we're talking about perspective, and we have just a few little tools for us today because we're not using a ruler anymore. We're done with linear perspective. We're actually going to be talking about aerial perspective. So let's review what you need for today. You need a couple pieces of standard white paper, a regular pencil, a grade eraser, and if you have it, a piece of charcoal or even just your softest pencil, so something that can be darker lines than your standard pencil. Okay, perspective is when you're trying to make something flat, look 3D, or have depth in the real world. And so we learned about linear perspective. But not everything has straight lines. It's not a box or a cube or a house. Supposing you're just outside. Well, that's what we're going to be talking about today, the landscape and the use of aerial perspective. Now, do you know what a landscape is? Here at our art club, we've looked at a lot of landscapes when we've talked about art, but just to make sure, just listen to the word, landscape. It means it's an outdoor scene, has land in it. Here's a landscape up here on our table. Artists often do landscapes, and some of them may be just like what you see out your window. In fact, look out your window now if you're somewhere near a window. Maybe you just see a playground or some buildings. That would be more like a cityscape. If you have the good fortune to live near the ocean where you look out the window at the water, then you would be looking at a seascape. Got it? So there's a landscape, that would be a field or mountains. And even though there might be people or animals or buildings in it, if it's an outdoor scene, it's a landscape. Here's an amazing landscape by the German-American artist Albert Bierstadt. He was one of those artists that came west when the country was just discovering travel through train across the country to look at the beautiful and magnificent western part of the United States. And so this painting is called Mountain Landscape. You'll notice there's a variety of textures and values in this painting. Dark values in the lower right and light tones in the sky and the mountains in the back. He used a lot of texture, varying sizes, a lot of different values to create a really beautiful landscape. Now here's another painting. This is a seascape by the artist Winslow Homer. It's called The Gulf Stream. There's a lot of action in this painting, large waves, some scary sharks, and a lonely sailor fighting to keep his boat upright. You can even see a storm starting in the background of the painting right above the horizon line. So there you have a landscape and a seascape, and so you get the idea that any type of outdoor scene has that word scape as the second part of the compound word. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the landscape. Now today we're only going to work in black and white for our landscape so that you understand some important rules for having aerial perspective. Aerial, that word means relating to the air. Some people might call it atmospheric perspective because of the atmosphere. What happens when you're standing outside and just the air between where you are and what you're looking at, what does it do to what you're looking at? I'm sure you've seen this. If you've been on a family drive and you're going through the country, perhaps you see that the distant mountains look much paler, much duller than what you can see up close. That's a function of aerial perspective. That famous Renaissance artist and inventor, Leonardo da Vinci, did a lot of work both on linear perspective and on aerial perspective, and he's the one who gave it that name, aerial perspective. Okay, so to get started, we're going to start where you might think we'd start when we're doing something with perspective, the horizon line, but we're not going to be using a ruler. We're simply going to be using either a pencil, I'm going to be using something heavier like charcoal so you can see it, and our horizon line, rather than being really straight, is going to be kind of bumpy and wavy. The horizon line is where the sky and the land meet. So, about the middle of your page, you're going to do a line that's kind of wavy across like that. Everyone's is going to look different, and that's fine. Now I'm drawing kind of dark so that you can see it, but you keep your lines light. That's always important for a young artist so that you can always erase what you don't like. Now, one of the rules of aerial perspective is that objects that are close are larger than objects that are farther away. We talked about that when we learned linear perspective. So we're going to put just a few elements into our landscape to understand these principles. So one of the first elements we're going to put in is a tree, and that's going to be a pine tree, and we're going to have it in our foreground, so it's going to be large because it's close, it's up front. Now friends, I know you might be tempted to draw your pine tree kind of like a fake Christmas tree, but that's not how a tree really looks. So I'm going to start off with a pencil, and I'm going to draw, starting on the left, kind of straight lines, not really straight parallel lines, because no tree trunk is perfectly straight like a telephone pole, and I'm going to cross up over into my horizon line. Make it a little wider at the bottom and gets narrow at the top. Now a pine tree kind of has a triangular shape, but there's so much texture and there's so much richness and space between the branches that your best bet is to take something like charcoal, and you're simply going to make marks by starting with a point and making almost like scribbly marks that have a lot of space in between, like this. Notice how dark these marks are? That's because this object is in the foreground, so I can make darker lines. See how it's kind of scribbly? I'm going to follow along my trunk line to make the bark. Now if I were to do a same type of pine tree further back, the object will be smaller. So let's do that now. I'm going to put some pine trees over here, but I don't want them to be in the foreground. That means the base of my trunk will be further up, more in my middle ground. And let's put one here, and maybe one here, a little bit further. So right away we notice they're going to be smaller. As objects recede in the distance, they get smaller. I'm making an assumption that all these pine trees are about the same size. So to show depth in my drawing, I will make them appear smaller. And because it's smaller from the bottom, it will also be smaller from the top. And so it will kind of be in this shape area here. Now before I'm going to put in my branches, there's the second rule of aerial perspective, and that's bolder, darker lines are up front, but as you recede, your lines get finer and lighter. Okay. So I might still use my charcoal, but I won't press quite as hard, and I'll make my lines a little thinner because it's going to be finer and lighter. And you can do this with pencil as well. Because it's texture in the leaves, I'm just kind of making marks, random marks that kind of flow in a kind of triangular shape. So they already look like they're further back. What if I were going way back into the background? Well, let's define our background and then you'll see what I mean. Back here we're going to put some mountains. Okay, so this is still our horizon line because it's the ground. Remember, mountains rise up out of the ground. So I'm going to make some mountains, which means they're kind of jagged. What you don't want to do, my friends, is for mountains is make a bunch of upside down V's, because no mountains look like that. So just kind of drag your pencil or your charcoal, and then you have mountains. So this is our horizon line. These are the mountains rising up out of the horizon line. So supposing I want some pine trees at the base of the mountain. I want to show that they're way back there. So the aerial perspective rule that we're using is objects get smaller, appear to be smaller, the further back we go. So now I want to keep my lines light, and there'll be some trees back here. They'll be the smallest. And my lines will be much lighter. Aerial perspective tells us that bold, dark lines are what's closest to us. Finer lines and lighter colors are further back. So the trees back here will be much finer and lighter. And the last rule of aerial perspective talks about the level of detail. When things are up close, you can see a lot of detail. Perhaps you've seen some of those fun puzzle books where it's really close-up pictures, it has a lot of detail. Just look maybe at fabric or any other painting or picture where you can really get up close, really see it. But if something's further away, you don't see that detail. So you'll notice I can barely see the branches of these pine trees that are far away, but I could probably make out some branches and even texture of the bark because it's up close. Take a look at this painting. This is by the great American artist Andrew Wyeth. He made beautiful landscapes, and this one has a beautiful tree as its focal point. It's a tree that's in winter, so there's no leaves on it, but you can see amazing detail in the bark, how the texture of the bark pops off the page. But you'll notice there's a building in this painting, and because it's in the middle background, it's further away and you don't see the detail of any brick or stone in the wall. You know it's a house, but you don't see the detail because it's further away. So, for the Pennsylvania landscape by Andrew Wyeth, you got to see all of the principles of aerial perspective put into place. Detail, dark values up front, lighter in the back, objects as they recede getting smaller. Look at other paintings and see if you can pick out those same rules. Now back to our landscape. To use that rule of detail, let's put in a road. Maybe just a hiking trail through these woods. And so we're going to have it larger in the front, but it's going to curve around and get smaller as it heads back. So here's our road, but it's starting to get smaller as it heads back. Aerial perspective. But I might want to put in some detail, maybe some boulders or rocks or indentation in the road, bumps in the road, because it's a hiking trail. Maybe some grass on the edges. But you won't see that level of detail way back here. And I'm even going to make it lighter as it recedes. Make that road go all the way to the horizon. That reminds me of a great Bible verse, the road leading to the horizon. It's in Nehemiah. Let me share it with you. The prophet Nehemiah in the Old Testament was recalling how God spoke to the Israelites through his prophet Moses. And this is what he said. Nehemiah 1:9. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the furthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to a place that I have chosen to be a dwelling for my name. See, God was telling Moses that he was going to lead the Israelites into the promised land, and a land that was flowing with milk and honey. If they would just listen to God and obey him, he would take them to that wonderful place. And I bet that was an amazing landscape. But it talks in there about from the furthest horizon. See, even the people back then could see the horizon line, and they knew that there was much beyond it, and it was very far away, and they kept marching on, heading towards that. Well, if you want to create that sense of depth and space, you need to use all the rules of aerial perspective to show the furthest horizon. Remember those rules. The first, objects that are closer appear larger. Objects that are further away appear smaller. Our second rule, use bolder, darker lines in the foreground where things are closer, but your lines get finer and lighter as they're further away. And the third rule of aerial perspective is that when things are closer to you, you can see a lot of detail. But as things get further away, there's less detail and things get a little fuzzy. So that's just our quick landscape to understand aerial perspective. But I'm so excited because, friends, when you join me next time at our club meeting, we're going to be continuing working on a landscape and moving on to color. So I hope you'll join me and bring a friend along. See you then.